Hello. Just a quick beheading tonight. First, the book's editing is finally done. I'm just waiting for the proofs, which should arrive between the 10th to the 12th. And then if everything is going all right, probably by around the 15th of August, the new book will be out. And I'm actually going to look into possibly doing an advance, promotion or something where you can order the book before it's even out. But I haven't done one of those before, so I need to just look up how to do it. But anyway, today we're going to take another head. And this guy's a Protestant, and once again, he insists on people calling him doctor. He just, there's a lot of reasons not to trust doctors these days, isn't it? Especially when they're doctors of philosophy or theology or something. So the offending creature in this case is a guy called Dr. White. And apparently he's got quite a decent following of, mentally challenged people that believe Protestantism has got anything to offer. Now, how this all came about is that my friend James Fox Higgins, who I've done a couple of interviews with and so on, posted a tweet. He's searching, he's looking. Eventually he'll come home to Catholicism, where the truth lies, won't you, James? And so I'm guessing that he saw this Dr. White's videos or whatever, and he posted a tweet that said, "I think it's weird that Sola Scriptura apologists, case in point, Dr. James White, so often use secondary texts like dictionaries and Greek lexicons to show you that what the Bible really means is that it is totally sufficient in and of itself. It seems like insanity to me." Now, to be fair to this Dr. James White, I don't think there's anything wrong with using Greek lexicons and dictionaries and so on to find out exactly what a word meant at the time that it was written and how it was probably going to be interpreted by the people who it was written for. So I've got no issue with that. Unfortunately, the response from Dr. James White was not really all that good. And I sort of understand where the other James, my friend James Fox Higgins, is coming from, because he's sort of saying, well, if the Bible is sufficient on itself, then, basically what he's saying is, if Sola Scriptura is a thing, why are you going to other sources? Now, again, in fairness to the Dr. White, if you're limiting those other sources to dictionaries, what Greek used to mean at the time, what Hebrew used to mean at the time, I can see that as being all right. But the whole point of Sola Scriptura is completely idiotic. Sola Scriptura means that the Bible is it, and that's all you need. Now, it's very interesting how this Dr. White approaches it, because, and by the way, I've put a link at the bottom here to a blog post, because I've done a blog post on this as well, so that, it's in writing. There's no dodging. And I've put a link that starts in about 30 minutes in. And for the first 5 minutes or so, this James White basically talks about how he's been talking about Sola Scriptura for 30 years, and even most Protestants don't use the term correctly. They don't really know what Sola Scriptura means. Of course, this is normal, because Protestants, being that there are over 40,000 official branches of them, have at least 40,000 different ideas about what Sola Scriptura is, and probably more like 1 million ideas, because there's, I think, in the region of probably close to 1 billion ideas. Actually, I think there's probably something like 900 million Protestants, more or less. Anyway, so he starts off by saying how he's taught Sola Scriptura for over 30 years, but only a very small number of people actually know what is really meant by Sola Scriptura. We'll take him at his word and we'll use his own definition. Doesn't matter what everybody else thinks it means. We'll just use his definition. I want to be fair to the man. So he defines Sola Scriptura as only Scripture, i.e. the Bible, as being God-breathed. These are his words, God-breathed. So he says that when you talk, you can hear the breath in front of your hand, and the Bible is the only God-breathed scripture. In other words, as if it came from God's mouth itself. And there is nothing else of that level of quality and as inerrant and perfect as that. Now, I've got immediately a couple of questions here, which is who defined what the Bible is actually composed of? Because how do you know what is the Bible and what isn't the Bible? First of all, the Bible was put together about 300 years after Jesus ascended. So right there, you got a bit of an issue. And then, good old Martin Luther came along and ripped out some books out of it and changed it again. But, to be fair to him again, he does give us a clue. He doesn't tell us what the canonical things of the Bible are. Maybe he tells us somewhere else. I am not going to go look at all his videos. In fact, to be fair, I've looked at the first 10 minutes of his video, and within 5 minutes of those 10 minutes, you could tell that he's just wrong and badly educated and not very smart. But I, suffered through at least another 20 minutes or so just to make absolutely sure. And I didn't watch the whole video. I watched the half an hour that sort of related to this. And it's enough. It's enough to completely break down his thing. So starts out about 30 minutes in, but about 39 minutes in, he tells us that the Bible, scripture, as he calls it, took 1,500 years to be put together. So to my first question, which is like, hey, the Bible was put together about 300 years after Jesus ascended, and then your guy, Martin, changed it. So how do you know when you're done? So that's my first question, is who defines what the Bible actually is? Because pretty much everybody had agreed what the Bible was 300 years after Jesus ascended, and it didn't change for 1,200 years until a fat German came along who wanted to bang nuns and changed it, especially the Epistle of James, which was really getting up his nose because, the whole thing about sola fides, so only scripture and only faith. You can only be saved by faith alone. Except in James it says exactly the opposite of that. So that all of a sudden has got to come out of the Bible. That's not the Bible anymore. That's not the official Bible. So first of all, who defines it? And secondly, how do you know when the final editing is finished? Because, by faith alone and Sola Scriptura certainly are not in the Bible. Along came the German and changed it. Fat German who swears and says that if the wife's not willing, you've got to bang the maid. That guy, he was obviously a prophet, right up there with, Muhammad or something. And I guess he got it all right? But how do you know you're done? I mean, what if some guy comes along a little bit later, just, maybe somebody who changed his name from Bruce to Caitlin, and decides that, hey, the whole thing about Paul talking badly about, homosexuals, that's apocrypha too. That's not the real Bible. That's other stuff that's not God-breathed. Just like I guess the Epistle of James is not God-breathed because it's apocrypha. It's not canonical, according to the Protestants. So along comes Caitlin, who's now a beautiful woman from being a, Olympic gymnast type man, but never mind. And he comes along and he said, no. Paul, apocrypha. He wasn't real apostle, you got this other thing, he fell off the horse. Nah, that part of the Bible, that's not the real God-breathed stuff. Faggotry, all good. Trannies, all good. Yeah, and that happens because, you've got Protestants that accept gay marriage, accept abortion, accept everything. In fact, you've got Protestant ministers, women, that take down the cross from their church so that it doesn't offend potential Muslims who might just wander in as tourists, I guess, or fellow worshippers, who knows. So right there, you've got a bit of an issue with defining Sola Scriptura as the Bible. Well, who defines it? Because your guy changed it. And how do you know it's the end? Right there, problem. But then about 38 minutes and 30 seconds or so, he goes on to state the hilarious statement that, that's what the enemies do. The enemies try to degrade Scripture precisely so it can be attacked and become all as not God-breathed? Well, a bit of projection going on there, since your guy changed the Bible first. That was kind of item 1 on his list. And secondly, your Protestant translations of the Bible, which generally all originate from the King James Bible, are crappy, shitty translations that have been degraded by Pharisees for 700 years, because your translation of the supposedly Hebrew Bible was edited for 700 years by Pharisees, people who literally rejected Jesus Christ, while the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible, was a more correct translation of the original Hebrew before the Pharisees messed around with it for 700 years, and of the original Greek. So the Latin Vulgate is actually a more accurate and a more correct and also theologically correct Bible when you compare it to the King James abomination. So again, you guys are the ones that went in and started to change it. So you're trying to blame the Catholics for changing the Bible? Dude, we've had the same Bible since day dot. Hasn't changed. Still the same Latin, Latin translation of the original Hebrew and the original Greek, which is still a better translation and a clearer and more precise translation than any Protestant Bible. Also, we still have all the books in that, are saying we're apocrypha and not good books or whatever. So, he then goes on at about 40 minutes and 30 seconds in. He makes what possibly the most hilarious hypocritical statement of the decade, accusing non-Protestants of just inserting their own ideas into the Bible and all of them just having their own views instead of God's, to which my spontaneous reaction when I heard him say that was to literally laugh at the screen. I mean, that's why you have over 40,000 denominations of Protestantism, because not two of you guys can agree on anything. Now, as a Catholic, our dogma is written down. We've got a code of canon law. It's written down. Catechism of Trent, it's written down. And you don't get to pick and choose. There are dogmas of the Catholic Church. That's it. You either believe it or you're not a Catholic. End of. There's no discussion about it. There's no but I think. No, you either accept that or you're not a Catholic. It's very simple. So it's certainly not us that is changing and making our own views. It's you Protestants, and you particularly, Dr. James White. It's ridiculous. The level of hypocrisy is stunning. And then at 41 minutes 30, barely a minute later, he goes on to possibly outdo his latest idiotic statement, where you can't degrade any part of the Bible or make any part of it lower or less God-breathed than any other part. Except for the parts that Luther changed and degraded and said they're not really canonic. Apart from those parts, all the other parts are all the same. And possibly apart from the parts that, Caitlin, the transgender male woman, might decide to change and as the new prophet of Protestantism and decide that sodomy is just fine. Apart from those parts and possibly the parts that some other freak 500 years from now might come up with, it's quite ridiculous. Again, another minute later, 42 minutes in or so, he uses an example of what we, supposedly degrading Catholics, do with the Bible, and how we've inserted papal infallibility only 150 years ago without any basis, rhyme or reason. We just came up with it and we're saying that it's from oral tradition. That's what he says. Now, I really am giving this man the benefit of the doubt, because it is my opinion, I may be wrong, but it is my opinion, looking at him and looking at his generic body language and so on, it is my opinion that he's not intentionally, knowingly a deceitful liar. I think there is an element of that, but I wouldn't say that's his overall makeup. I think he is pig ignorant and obstinately stupid, which is a very rigidity of mind that is very common in Protestants. And he's blocked in his own little square, and he can't think outside of that box at all. And he's got a lot of wrong, crappy ideas. But, on this particular one, saying that the concept of papal infallibility is only 150 years old and we just came up with it from oral tradition, I mean, that level of stupidity is significant, because literally it would take you 10 seconds to Google papal infallibility, origin of, and find out a whole bunch of stuff, So not only is he ignorant, but he doesn't even bother to research the stuff that he speaks with supposed authority on. Now, just so you know, papal infallibility was always part of the church's decrees. If you read, there's in the blog post that I've made, in the first 700 years of Christianity, you've got multiple authors, writers, fathers of the church discussing how the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, has got primacy. And now people are going to say, but and in my own book, I differentiate between primacy of the Pope and papal infallibility. They are different concepts. However, there is a relationship. If you've got every single one of the church fathers for the first 700 years pretty much saying that and agreeing that the Bishop of Rome is first among equals, has got primacy, and by the way, there are many cases where the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was the defining vote when there was disagreement. So, 3 bishops say that, 4 bishops say that, this guy's undecided. Ultimately, the Bishop of Rome was the guy that said, guys, this is what actually is the thing, and that's what we're all going to agree. And he had the casting vote, he had the deciding vote, which was the primacy of it. Now, as Catholic, if you don't know this as a Protestant, that's, I suppose, normal. But as Catholic, not only do we believe in papal primacy and papal infallibility, but why do we believe in papal infallibility? Because it comes from the promise that Jesus made to the Catholic Church and to Peter, which is, I will always be with you. In other words, the Catholic Church is supernaturally protected, even though we've got prophecies that tell us that there will be bad men. There's always going to be bad men in the Catholic Church. There's always going to be, betrayers, liars, thieves, pederasts, whatever. I'm not referring to the Bergoglian, that is only pederasts in there, pretty much. But there's going to be bad guys in the Catholic Church because humans, and all humans are flawed, every single one of them. So there's going to be bad guys. There's also going to be a lot of good guys. And we know that towards the end, the Catholic Church gets wrecked to just a tiny remnant of faithful left, very tiny remnant left, which, sedeprivation so far fits that thing. But I'm not one of these guys that's like, we just should hide in the corner. No, we're going out fighting. We've got the Bohemond attitude when he was surrounded by 40,000 Muslims after he just literally the day before taken over Antioch. And there's only his knights are starving, they've got no water, food, they've got no more horses. And one priest goes, no, but the lance of Longinus is under that altar. And they dig, and sure enough, they find it. They decide, we're just going to charge up and charge these 40,000 Muslims. And they did, with odds of 400 to 1, some ridiculous numbers. And they kicked their ass. That's my attitude, okay? So don't you go thinking, the church. No, go out there, proselytize, become more, multiply. But in any case, so if you've got papal primacy, if the Pope gets to decide the casting vote, what does that mean? It means that ultimately the Pope has to be infallible when he's doing that, because the church is, the magisterium of the church is composed of the Pope and all the bishops, but ultimately the Pope has primacy over all the other bishops. And we know that the church is infallible because Jesus is infallible, and he said he will protect, he will be with the church to the end. So Jesus is infallible, therefore his church that he protects is going to be infallible. Who's the head of the church? The Pope. So when the Pope pronounces something officially for the whole church, he is infallible. Now this has been there from day dot, from the beginning. But if that was not enough to convince you, because the logic is too logical and makes perfect sense, you've got to also understand that it was actually specifically referred to and identified papal infallibility by a guy called Franciscan called Pierre de Jean Olivi. who lived in the year 1248 to 1298 roughly. And he was a Franciscan that had essentially got all these sort of rights and so on from the existing pope, and he was worried that if an anti-pope came along, and keep in mind there were plenty of anti-popes, especially in that period of time, if I remember right. What if an anti-pope comes along and takes away all our rights as Franciscan monks? And so he essentially wrote it out and put it in a tract that, hey, by the way, we've got papal infallibility, so just everybody remember that because of papal infallibility, a new pope cannot undo what a previous pope said, because all the popes are infallible. And so, you know, that's well more than, it's almost 1,000 years ago. No, it's 800 years ago. It's certainly a lot more than 150 years, where it was specifically identified. So yeah, Mr. James White, Dr. James White, doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He then goes on to, at about 43 minutes 40 seconds in, he makes the most, what I call the most hypocritical statement of the last 10 years, if some of the ones were above were the most hilarious, where he states that you can't have this new revelation because that, you know, this papal infallibility, in his opinion, counts as new revelation. Well, we've already shown you it's not new revelation, but the hilarious thing is that he says, well, you can't just have this new revelation that wasn't taught for the first 1,000 years of the church, and then you just slot it in. Well, you can't have that. That's just new revelation. That'll be wrong. There'll be change in the Bible. Wait a minute. So, apart from the fact, let's just ignore the fact that you're dead wrong. The papal infallibility was there from the beginning, and taught from the beginning, and specifically mentioned, 800 years ago, and specifically referred to in the first 700 years of the church multiple times with a pretty clear logical reasoning, which any half-competent Catholic knows, by the way. Only you Protestants are completely ignorant of this fact. So let's just ignore all of that. Let's just pretend that he's telling the truth, which he is not. He's wrong. But let's just pretend. His logic is completely flawed. Because you can't have a new doctrine suddenly pop out of nowhere because it wasn't taught for the first 1,000 years of the church, but 500 years after that, when it definitely was never taught that you could divorce, that priests could have wives, that you could, I don't know, what all the other crappy things of Protestantism, all of that stuff. 500 years after his supposed point, that guy comes up with something new. That's okay. That's all right. That's not new revelation. Really? Where does it say in the Bible that you can divorce? Because you Protestants do that. Martin Luther started banging nuns. It's very clear, again, if you're not Catholic, you won't know this, but we Catholics prefer Jesus over Paul. And Jesus says that there are certain men that are not designed, for physical reasons, moral reasons, whatever. They're not designed to marry and have children. And those guys should dedicate themselves wholly to God. And if those guys do that, those guys are the best people to teach and help the church, which they are. And we're not talking about homosexuals. We're talking about decent, normal men who dedicate themselves to God instead of a wife, family, and so on. Paul says that a priest should have his own house, his own wife, his own family in order, and that is because Paul was operating at the beginning of the church when most of the priests, bishops, etc., were already married, which was fine, But as more and more people became Catholics, then you had the pick of the crop, let's say, and eventually it became that. Well, also, by the way, even when a priest or a bishop, whatever, that was married became a priest or a bishop, it was implied that he would no longer have sex with his wife. And this goes back to Jewish beliefs and purity and so on. So there is a clear thread in the original Old Testament as well of purification before you have to do anything with God and so on. But anyway, putting all that aside, his logic is that, well, you can't have papal infallibility suddenly crop up because it wasn't taught in the first 1,000 years, which it was. But you can suddenly have divorce and whatever else, all the other Protestant rubbish, and no purgatory and no indulgences and all the other stuff that they've changed. Anybody can be a priest. Anybody can interpret the Bible. All that stuff suddenly is okay. And that's 500 years after what he's talking about. So honestly, the hypocrisy is just stunning. And then, again, just another, this is a little one, but this last point I've bothered to about 1 hour and 5 minutes in, he literally says that Ratzinger is wrong as can be, but still a brilliant theologian. That is the logic of Protestants, ladies and gentlemen. So Ratzinger, whose supposed job is to be a pope, and who was supposedly the head of the modern day Inquisition, which is what impresses the James White, because, he was the head of the modern Inquisition, for Christ's sake. He was a brilliant theologian. Totally wrong, but brilliant theologian. Excuse me? He's got one job. Supposedly to be pope. Of course, we know he's not pope. He's no more pope than, well, he's probably even less pope than I am, and I'm certainly no pope, okay? But so this guy who's got one job is wrong as can be, but is brilliant. That's like saying, a pilot of a plane that is in perfect working order and there's no adverse weather, who crashes the plane on takeoff because of his own stupidity. He crashed the plane and killed everybody on it, but brilliant pilot. That's the logic of Protestantism, I guess. Really, all I can say as I end off the blog is that David Dunning and Justin Kruger, the guys who came up with the Dunning-Kruger effect, they should probably send him a plaque or something, And that's it. That's my takedown of Dr. James White. Don't forget the doctor. And just Protestantism in general. Just say no, kids. Not even once. Proper Catholicism is where it's at. Good night.